Tonight's speaker is Dr. Dale Rosengarten. Dale currently serves as the curator of the Jewish Heritage Collection at the College of Charleston Library. She holds a BA, an MA, and a PhD from Harvard University. While she was curator of the Low Country Basket Project at the University of South Carolina's McKissick Museum, Dale wrote the exhibition catalog, which was titled Row Upon Row, Seagrass Baskets of the South Carolina Low Country. She also developed the landmark exhibition, A Portion of the People, 300 Years of Southern Jewish Life. That exhibit opened at McKissick in 2002. Dale and her husband Ted co-edited a book to accompany that exhibition. In 2003, Dale won an award from a group that I'm a member of, the State Historic Records Administration Board, and I want to share with you their statement of her accomplishments. Nearly single-handedly, Dr. Rosengarten has saved a vast body of threatened archival materials, has created a nationally recognized collection that is being used by scholars around the globe, has publicized the materials and her mission in a distinguished book and through the national media, has lectured on the subject, taught students on a one-to-one level, raised funding for the preservation and access of archival and related materials, sponsored the creation of a film, and influenced others in starting similar projects in other states. Now, after that, Dale went on to co-edit The Diary of Joseph Lyons, 1833 to 1835, which was published in American Jewish History, and her essay, Jewish Antiques Roadshow, Religion and Domestic Culture in the American South, was published in a volume titled Jewish Roots in Southern Soil, A New History, in 2006. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dale Rosengarten.
Thank you, Faye. That was lovely, mostly true. Though I do have to admit, my doctoral dissertation, I'm the only PhD in America in basket making. Because my other subject, the low country basket, was actually what I did my doctoral work on. And just for the record, there's an even more recent exhibition and book that I co-curated, co-authored, called Grassroots, African Origins of an American Art, which opened at the Gibbs in 2008. It's really a gorgeous subject and a beautiful book, so I encourage you all to look it up on Amazon.com. I don't think you can buy it in Charleston. It's an incredible privilege to be here in First Baptist, and also kind of it's a sign of Charleston's extraordinary record of religious tolerance, that this city has welcomed people of almost all faiths. The one faith excluded from the beginning were the Catholics, but Jews, heathens, and other dissenters from the purity of the Christian religion were actually writ into the fundamental constitutions with the very beginning of European and African settlement here. When Faye asked me if I'd talk on Charleston first, Charleston has so many Jewish firsts that I thought I might keep you here through supper. But I'm going to try to be sort of short and sweet and punchy. When Ted and I first got here in 1976, I was as ignorant as any Yankee about the Jewish history of this state. New York is a very provincial town, and if it didn't happen in New York, it's hard to make it into the popular culture up there. But I was soon to find out that South Carolina can boast many Jewish firsts. In fact, this colony and then state had a substantial Jewish population centuries before the families of my New York friends had arrived on these shores. I'm going to grab the clicker, which I left down here, Faye. There we go. I had to turn it on. I hope you can see the screen from where you're sitting. I can say that virtually all of these images are also on a website. It's called A Portion of the People, and it's produced by the University of North Carolina Davis Library, very accessible, with nice descriptions of each image. For most of you who live in Charleston and know this history, this may be old news, but it's useful to think of Carolina as the northernmost outpost, the frontier of the Caribbean plantation system, rather than the southernmost colony in the original 13 colonies. If you look at this map and the inset of the map, you'll see that the Sea of Carolina is really part of the West Indian region of the globe. And indeed, Charleston was established as a port with the intention of turning a profit, raising money for the 8 lords proprietors who were given the rights to this very enormous colony in the early days. As I said, the fundamental constitutions established probably the most tolerant provisions for religious freedom of anywhere on the planet in 1670. If you were a Jew living in Amsterdam, Hamburg, Spanish Town, Jamaica, and you looked around and said, where could I go and practice my faith, adopt any profession I want to, marry whom I liked, go into partnership with Gentiles, South Carolina would probably be near the top of the list in terms of places where you were allowed to be free. By 1697, the first Jews were naturalized in South Carolina, along with 65 Huguenots, or French Protestants. And I think this is one of the secrets of the success of this group of people. They kind of rode the coattails of the French Protestants, who were quickly accepted as full citizens in this colony. And perhaps they were interested in this for the same reasons. The colony was actually soliciting settlement from French Protestants who were being sent into exile with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 by the Catholic French establishment. They were people who were traders, were familiar with currencies, different languages, and the Jews, in a way, occupied the same niche. They too were in exile. They had been in exile for several centuries, from the Inquisition of 1492 and following, and they had some of the same mercantile interests and mercantile networks. I don't think it's accidental that the proprietors were particularly targeting these two groups of people as useful citizens, useful settlers. The Jews did come as merchants and traders, not often at the loftiest level, not necessarily international traders, but they traded in a great variety of goods. And from this advertisement, from very early advertisement from a pair of Jewish merchants, you can see that this was a global economy. This was a global trade, all the way from Asia, silks from China, cotton, prints from India, tea, etc. The world was much more connected in the 17th century and the 18th century than we sometimes think. The earliest settlers were Sephardim, which means people whose families originated on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain or Portugal. They had been in exile, as I said, for 200 years or more. So they had already adapted to other customs, other languages. A great many settled, as I said, in Amsterdam, London, Hamburg. Another whole contingent went to the Ottoman Empire. And when the Europeans started settling the New World, the Western Hemisphere, these merchants who had been established in these Western European ports were among the earliest settlers, especially of the English colonies in the West Indies. Jacob de Leon, and the de Leon is a Sephardic name. It's one of the sort of giveaways of where people come from. His family went from Portugal to Amsterdam to Spanish Town, Jamaica. And then toward the end of the 18th century, he moved to New York, married into a very elite family in New York, and eventually he and his wife, Hannah, came to Charleston to settle, starting a whole very important family of de Leons who became famous, some would say notorious, during the period of the Civil War, or as some people say, the late unpleasantness. Jamaica, like South Carolina, was a plantation economy producing crops for export. The family history, the Leon family history, is writ in the inscriptions in the front of this family Bible, and you can actually read here when Jacob goes to New York, marries Hannah Hendricks, when his first children are born. Another Sephardic family who certainly can be counted as a Charleston first, the Salvadors. Francis Salvador arrived in Charleston just a couple of years before the outbreak of the American Revolution. He had come to reestablish his family fortune. His uncle had bought an enormous piece of land, 100,000 acres, in the 96th district, which in the 18th century was the second most populous district in the state. He had the intention of establishing an indigo plantation. He advertised in the newspaper for an overseer who would control some 30 enslaved Africans on his plantation. But before he got going, he got swept into the revolutionary fervor and was elected to the first provisional Congress in this state, making him the first Jew elected in modern history in the Western world to public office. His the motto on his monument, and you can see a monument to him right here in Washington Park, said, "Born an aristocrat, died a Democrat." And indeed, he died right after the beginning of the conflict of the American Revolution, August 1st, 1776. He and his militia in the upstate were ambushed by a group of Tories and Cherokee Indians, their allies. He was this diorama, which now sits in the little museum at Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, made by Robert Whitehead from the Gibbs Museum, shows his assassination. He was actually scalped, according to the accounts, but survived long enough to find out from his captain that indeed they had prevailed in this engagement. So the first man to win elected office in the Western world was also the first Jew to die in the American Revolution. Now, not all of these early settlers were Sephardim. There were some, even at the very beginning, who were Ashkenazic, which means from German-speaking countries. There was no Germany, there were German states. That was a contingent of people whose native language, whose lingua franca was Yiddish, as opposed to Ladino for some of the Sephardim. The Ashkenazim, one of the men who came early on was Jonas Phillips, born Freibusch in the Rhineland. And he came as an indentured servant to another Jewish businessman named Moses Lindo, who turned out to be a very, very important character in the establishment of the South Carolina's economy. And I should say Carolina, because when he came, 1764, we were still a colony as opposed to a state. Lindo became the inspector of indigo, and by giving Carolina indigo high grades and making it a premium on the global market, he really established this an important crop, second only to rice at that time. Jonas Phillips was his servant, his indentured servant, presumably in his business, and after his term of servitude moved to New York, where he had a very rocky career, but during the American Revolution became one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia. He had left New York during the Revolution. And by the way, the father of 22 children, all with the same wife. Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim was one of the first 5 congregations established in the New World, in North America, on the same location where it exists today on Hazel Street. 1749, the congregation was chartered. 1794, the building was completed. This is an engraving made of the original synagogue, 1794, after it burned to the ground in the fire of 1838. The artist who rendered the building was Salvador Nunez Carvalho, Sephardic name. His family had come through Barbados. His uncle had been one of the early chazans in the 19th century. The word chazan means cantor or reader, and most of the congregations in the New World, in America, were led by these lay spiritual leaders really until the 1840s and 50s. There were no rabbis, no ordained rabbis in this country. More Charleston firsts. Abraham Alexander was the second chazan, the second leader of KK Beth Elohim. He became one of the 4 Jews among the 11 founders of Scottish Rite Masonry in this city. Scottish Rite Masonry was an incredibly important mechanism, a network to bring especially immigrants into the social and business life of the city. And Alexander was among the men who led this organization. This is actually a modern rendering of the founding of Scottish Rite on the corner of Church and Broad in Shepherd's Tavern. Charleston had the first Hebrew Orphan Society and the first Hebrew Benevolent Society in America. This is, again, a modern version of the Hebrew Benevolent Society symbol. Charity defeats death is a rough translation of their motto. Charity is a very important value in the Jewish religion. People are constantly exhorted to give, and a tzedakah box, a charity box or alms box, is one of the most familiar pieces of Judaica you find. When we were looking for objects for a portion of the people, I was lucky enough to encounter a collector who had this beautiful little silver box, and around the rim it says, "This alms box belongeth to Kahal Kadosh, Charleston, South Carolina, 1820. So it's a beautiful, very well inscribed, well documented piece. The early Jewish settlers in this town were perhaps not among the most elite, but they certainly moved into the gentry, and both in terms of their business, their residence, their lifestyle, their costume, were in many ways indistinguishable from other upper-class, affluent Charlestonians. One of the most beautiful portraits, and it belongs to the Gibbs Museum, it's often on display there, we had restored for the exhibit portion of the people, is Leah Lazarus Cohen. Leah Lazarus was from a Sephardic family. Her father had been one of the founders of KK Beth Elohim. She married a Polish peddler named Moses Cohen. When he died, he was one of the wealthiest men in town. And you can see their house. It's now owned by the Catholic Diocese, right across from the cathedral. They faced it with marble, so it looks a little grander today than it did when they were living there. But that was the home of Leah Lazarus and her husband. She's wearing, just below her collar, what could be a locket, but is more likely a miniature, which was the way that people kept loved ones close to their hearts in days before photography. It turns out that there were many little miniature portraits of these early Jews, and by far my favorites are this pair. This is Sarah Moses Levy. The descendants of this lady call her Grandma Moses, and her son, Chapman Levy, who became a very important landowner, politician, owned a brickyard in Columbia. But if you look very closely at these two portraits, you'll see that Sarah is wearing the portrait of her son. Can you see that? Right below her collar again, she actually, you can see it's the same character. So this is a pair that have remained together literally in the same piece of tissue paper in the same drawer. These are made about 1798. For well over 200 years, the mother and son have been inseparable even after their owners, the family that owned this pair, no longer knew who they were. They knew that they were members of the family, but we had to help them with genealogy to trace the exact identity. And the family, which is a prominent Mississippi family now, no longer Jewish, they haven't been Jewish in many generations, were generous enough to donate these and two other miniatures from the Levy family to our collection at the college. Abraham Moise, another early settler, he and his wife Sarah fled the revolution in Saint-Domingue in the West Indies in 1791, brought 4 of their children to Charleston, along with many other French-speaking refugees. They had 5 more children, and their children all survived, which is remarkable in this time and place. 9 Moise children survived, and many, many of their descendants are now living across the United States, several right here in Charleston. Very few are still Jewish, but they reached incredible levels of achievement. Sarah and Abraham never became affluent again. It's said that they were actually plantation owners in Saint-Domingue, but they sold tea from a small shop on the corner of King and Queen in this city. But their children became poets, hymnalists, reform leaders, painters, really occupied a prominent place in the intellectual life of Charleston. For a portion of the people, we gathered a small group of the Moise descendants on the piazza of the house where Abraham Jr., the son of Abraham and Sarah, lived with occasionally his sister Penina Moise. This is a house actually on the college campus. It's now facing George Street. They turned it around when they cut off College Street. And this is some of the assembled Moise family. You may recognize some of these characters. Probably some of you know Ben Moise. He's perhaps the most public and the proudest of all the Moises. Caroline Agnes Moise Lopez, who is our cover girl of the book, which I really encourage you to look at. It's a gorgeous book. It's a huge bargain at $35. And it's available in many places in Charleston. Cairo Moise, as she's known in the family, was painted by her grandfather, Theodore Sidney Moise, perhaps one of the best portrait painters of his time, produced in Charleston. We don't know much about his training, but his portraits have been surfacing kind of mysteriously over the last 10 or 15 years. It's one of the great things about doing a project like ours, which has longevity. We put out an exhibition and a book and a film, and all of a sudden, people come out of the woodwork and say, I'm a Moise too, and I have a portrait. So we're finding more and more of Theodore Sidney's work, and he really is a spectacular painter. There are 4 of his portraits that were in A Portion of the People, and I have to say that they are, just by art history standards, the 4 best. So in 1825, when this city directory was published, Jews were important enough in the city so that there was a whole page listing their feasts and festivals. Now, whether this was to let Jews know when to celebrate or to let people know when the stores would be closed, I don't know. But it really speaks to the prominence of the group and their recognition by the general society. In the year 1800, there were more Jews in Charleston, South Carolina, than anywhere else in North America. We're talking about small numbers, about 500 Jews here, about 400 in New York, at a time when the island of Jamaica had a Jewish population of 2,000. So it's a little, geography was a little different then, but Charleston was seriously the center of Jewish culture and intellectual life in North America at that time. The same man who did the engraving of the exterior of KKBE painted this interior, Solomon Nunez Carvalho. It's a beautiful, haunting image painted from memory after the fire. And it hangs today in KKBE in that little museum room as if it was an unimportant object. It's probably one of the most important Jewish paintings in the country, and recognized as such. The feeling of, I would almost say, spirituality and also a feeling of loss. This building had just burned down. When he finished the painting, he offered it to the trustees of the congregation, quote, for what they thought it was worth, and they paid him $50. 1825 is also a very important year in American Jewish history, and frankly, it's underreported. It's really almost still a hidden secret. A group of young American-born congregants from KK Beth Elohim formed a society they called the Reformed Society of Israelites, and they petitioned trustees of the congregation to institute certain changes in the liturgy and in the practice. They were summarily dismissed, and they broke off and created their own organization, their own congregation. They collected money for a synagogue, which was never built, but they met separately for at least 8 years. The Reformed Society of Israelites was the first movement to reform Judaism in America. It was homegrown. It was not an import from Germany. It was 20 years before Isaac Mayer Wise and the Cincinnati movement got going. It didn't succeed, but it planted the seeds. The leader of that movement, and this is a silhouette of Isaac Harvey, was a local writer. He was a publisher, he's a teacher, he ran academies. I think McCrady's restaurant is upstairs. The long room in McCrady's was one of his schoolrooms. He taught, we think, at the college briefly, and he was a great polemicist. He liked to talk to the powers that be about his beliefs. These are a sampling of his work, all of these documents are now part of our collection. He wrote 3 terrible plays. His brother, whose name was George Washington Harvey, also wrote plays. We have some of those in manuscript. But he and his cohort, there were 3 prominent men, Abraham Moise Jr., David Carvalho, who was the father of Solomon Nunez, and Isaac Harvey, each hand wrote a prayer book. And those are the earliest Reformed prayer books in America, one of which is in our collection, although we have loaned it to the new National Museum of American Jewish History, so it's been up in Philadelphia for the last year and a half. Well, one of the things Harvey got excited about politically, Mordecai Manuel Noah, another Charleston-born Jew, who was also a journalist and also a very political character, had been dismissed from his post as consul to Tunis by a man named James Monroe, who was then Secretary of State, later President. And Monroe said the reason that he wanted Noah gone was because it wasn't appropriate for a Jew to represent America in an Arab country. This was 1816. Harvey got on his soapbox and fired off a letter to Monroe and said, Jews are not to be considered a religious sect. They constitute a portion of the people. And that's where we got our title. It really expressed the role that this group of people played in this society. They were part of the social fabric, and they acted as such. Penina Moise, I've mentioned before, this was a sister of Abraham Moise Jr., who was the Reform leader. She wrote the first book of hymnals, of hymns for a Jewish congregation, and it was published right here in Charleston in 1841, the first Jewish hymn book in America. She was painted, we think, by Theodore Sidney Moise. It's not signed, but this painting has the hallmarks of his work. And over her shoulder, you see a conflagration, which we think represented the burning of the synagogue in 1838. She was a Sunday school teacher and very, very devoted to the congregation. We have a pretty complete archive of the congregational records of this congregation. This is the 1838 minute book and the very page where they're describing the laying of the new cornerstones for the second synagogue, the second sanctuary, which stands today on the original footprint on Hazel Street. It's open to the public at least 5 days a week, and they do wonderful tours. There's this little museum. The sanctuary is beautiful. This is the title page of Penina's hymnal. I call it her hymnal. She wrote the majority of the lyrics, not all. Maybe not quite as spectacular as the house of worship we're in now, but it's a pretty beautiful place, and I really encourage everybody and anybody to walk in and take a look. Joshua Lazarus was the chairman of the building committee when they built the new building. And you'll notice, and again, most of you who live in this city know that after the 1838 fire, most of the institutional buildings that were rebuilt were built in the classic Greek style. And there's no real difference between Hibernian Hall, St. Mary's, KK Beth Elohim in terms of architectural style. Josh Lazarus was the chairman of the building committee. His wife, who was from Liverpool, I could give you chapter and verse on them, but you need to read it in the book. It's a very interesting story. When the congregation dedicated the building in March of 1841, he gave the congregation this lovely little silver basket, and inscribed on the cartouche, it says, dedicated to KK Beth Elohim, Josh Lazarus, 1841. It remained as an object in the temple until 1861, when the war between the states broke out, and not only KKB, but lots of houses of worship here and other institutions sent their valuables to Columbia for safety. We know what happened, and this little object disappeared. In 1964, a full 100 years later, a couple from New Jersey came to town to go to a meeting of the American Jewish Historical Society, Mr. and Mrs. Schwartz. And they met the people who were then at the head of KK Beth Elohim and realized that this object they had bought in an antique store in Connecticut a few years before belonged originally to that congregation. 20 years later, they returned it to KKBE, and again, it's on display in the little museum. We think that in the years between the gift in 1841 and the disappearance in 61, it was used as an etrog container. That's one of the, it's a ritual object. It was not made for that. It was made as a sugar bowl. We know that from many pictures of early sugar bowls. We know who made it, 1777, Daniel Bell. Probably had a blue glass lining. But it's an object that was sanctified by use. In other words, it was put to another purpose and became a piece of Judaica. At the same time that the KK Beth Elohim was struggling with reform, and there was a schism, there was a whole break-off group, another group of immigrants came through who were very different from these early acculturated Charleston Jews. These were people from Central Europe who spoke Yiddish, practiced Orthodoxy. They were not interested in either the Sephardic minhag, the liturgy of the Sephardim, nor were they interested in the reform of KK Beth Elohim. And they formed their own congregation under this man's leadership, Rabbi Hirsch Zvi Levine, and it eventually became Bris Shalom, which today is the Orthodox congregation. This is the first Ashkenazic Orthodox congregation in South Carolina. Some people claim the whole South, but I'm not going to go that far. But what is first, and the Bris Shalom rabbi, when we kind of uncovered the story and found the rabbi's notebook, was very happy to point out, this man was an ordained rabbi. And it means that Bris Shalom was founded by a person who had smicha, who had ordination, making him surely the first ordained rabbi in the state of South Carolina, if not the South. I'm going to move quickly so that we can get time for Q&A. So far I've been talking mostly about port Jews, people who made their living as merchants or city dwellers. Enough of those people achieved sufficient affluence to actually buy plantations and move into the gentry, move into the landed gentry. One of those couples was Rebecca and Isaiah Moses, who bought the oaks at Goose Creek. And this is Elizabeth O'Neill Werner's beautiful pastel on silk, owned by the Gibbs, of the oaks at Goose Creek. It's a technique she called Werner color because she invented it, and it was a kind of layering of pastel on silk cloth. It is luminous. It is simply exquisite. Both Rebecca and Isaiah were painted, like a lot of Charleston gentry. Isaiah painted by Theodore Sidney Moise again. Rebecca by a less-known character. One of the things I'll point out about these portraits, and they're not pendant portraits, they weren't made at the same time or meant to hang together. Rebecca is holding a book, and conventional wisdom is that Jews of this class did not put symbolic objects in their paintings to indicate their Jewish affiliation. They were just like all the other people. But the book she's holding, you can't see the letters, but it looks like a Bible. The very blocky letters, it looks like Hebrew, and they look like they're in verses. And if this is true, it runs contrary to the idea that Jews were not anxious to identify as Jews in their public presentations, such as in formal portraits. They bought the plantation in 1811, I believe, and had it surveyed in 1817. This is in the collection of the South Carolina Historical Society, the original plat. I don't think it was a very productive plantation on Goose Creek. It didn't have enough rice land. I think most of what they did there was timbering, raising provision crops. They had quite a lumber business that I think many, especially the Ashley River plantations, they also had a brickyard. And all of these pursuits were trying to turn a little bit of a profit. But in the meantime, they kept their store on King Street. And Rebecca is pretty much continuously listed in the directories as being a merchant on King Street. And you'll notice I said Rebecca. Isaiah is listed as a planter, but she's minding the shop. This is a grandson of the Moses couple, who died, unfortunately, in one of the terrible epidemics, 1857. And it's a truly tragic story. His father, at that point, was a pharmacist in Savannah, came running back to his son's bedside after treating many, many people in Savannah when these terrible fevers were raging, didn't get here in time. His son had perished. And according to the records of the descendants, his father was never again able to mention his son's name in the house. The other set of grandparents of this young man, this child, were a family who originated in Georgetown, South Carolina, the Solomons. And when